Hank walked into the hospital room. He looked like he had seen something terrifying. Dr. Choi went over to see what had happened, but Hank fled in panic. Dr. Choi saw a few nurses comforting the sobbing Hank. He was curious about what had happened. However, when he asked, April simply pulled the privacy curtain. A little while later, the nurses came out, helping Hank gather his clothes and bag. It seemed he was leaving work early. Dr. Choi hurried to ask about Hank's situation, but April avoided talking about it. Moreover, the patient was also being treated coldly by the nurses. No one was attending to him. Dr. Choi grew frustrated. He asked April to draw the patient's blood, but she said she was too busy. Then, he approached another nurse, who said she was about to go off duty.
Draw Mr. Kaminsky's blood first, so don't bother clocking back in.
The nurse, looking displeased, went to the patient's room, but soon loud screams came from inside. When Dr. Choi arrived, he saw several bleeding needle marks. He knew the nurse had done it on purpose. After all, she had over 10 years of experience. Dr. Choi was completely enraged. Since the senior nurses were acting with impunity, he decided to start with the interns. A charge of mishandling a patient would be enough to make the younger nurses comply.
Monique.
Your patient's a child molester. He was Hank's piano teacher. He raped him when he was a little boy.
Even though the man's behavior was perverse, at the end of the day, he was still a patient. Dr. Choi demanded that the nurses treat him fairly, or he would report the matter. Later, Dr. Choi went to check on the patient's condition. When the man mentioned that he had been a piano teacher for 30 years, Dr. Choi asked another question.
You have a lot of students?
Enough to keep me occupied.
Looking at the old man's lecherous smile, Dr. Choi suppressed his anger and left. However, not long after, the old pervert went into ventricular fibrillation. The doctors tried everything, but in the end, he still died. As Dr. Choi watched the nurses walk away coldly, he had a sense that something was wrong. Later, he found 4 empty vials of epinephrine in the trash, but only one had been used during the resuscitation. Seeing the nurses whispering to each other, Dr. Choi felt something was amiss. He confronted April with his suspicions, fearing she had acted impulsively and caused the patient's death. That would be a crime. But April denied that anyone had done such a thing. So Dr. Choi asked his assistant to check with the medical examiner immediately. It turned out that the patient's epinephrine levels were indeed high, but the cause was a pheochromocytoma, a tumor of the adrenal medulla, meaning the patient had died of natural causes and the nurses had nothing to do with it.
Help me!
A man anxiously carried his son into the hospital, pleading for help. April quickly led them to Dr. Choi for an examination. The man explained that his son had kidney failure, but his ex-wife had not properly taken him to the hospital for treatment, so he had brought the boy in himself. At that moment, a nurse called the doctor out of the room. Turned out that the man was a fugitive wanted nationwide. He had taken his son during a prison bail period. April asked if they could wait until the boy's condition improved before calling the police, but Dr. Choi said the decision wasn't up to them. Their primary responsibility was to ensure the patient's safety. Dr. Choi then returned to the room. Because of the boy's kidney failure, other organs were starting to malfunction, and he was now experiencing arrhythmia. Just as Dr. Choi and the man were discussing the treatment plan, the police arrived.
You didn't have to do this.
Sorry, legally, I had to.
The man knew he would have to leave soon. He said his goodbyes to his son. He told the boy to trust Dr. Choi to take good care of him. The police announced the man's charges and officially arrested him. Feeling sympathetic, Dr. Choi stopped the police and said that the boy's condition was very serious and he needed a kidney transplant. He asked if the man could stay to see if he was a match for the transplant. The police agreed temporarily, but they will have to ask the prosecutor later. However, this decision was opposed by the newly appointed medical director. Despite this, Dr. Choi still proceeded with the transplant compatibility test for the man. Blood test shows a perfect match. Dr. Choi wants to perform surgery immediately. Even knowing that there were no other suitable candidates within an 800-kilometer radius, the hospital leader still said that she did not want the hospital's reputation to be affected by the outcome of a fugitive surgery. If he died, it would be a significant mark against the hospital's rating. Dr. Choi had no choice but to contact other hospitals to see if they were willing to take on the surgery. In the end, the man was still taken away. Meanwhile, the boy's condition severely worsened. Without a kidney transplant, the boy could die at any moment. The man pleaded to have his handcuffs removed so he could say goodbye to his son. He tearfully kissed his son's forehead and walked out of the room in despair. Suddenly, the man grabbed the police officer's gun. He pointed the gun at the officer, demanding the transplant surgery be done immediately. As the standoff escalated, the man felt completely hopeless. He then turned the gun on himself.
Do it now! No!
The boy's surgery was finally successfully performed. At the same time, the hospital that had been contacted for help responded, saying they were willing to perform the transplant.
Hey! Oh!
In the middle of the night, a man brought his girlfriend to the emergency room. He said she was suddenly experiencing severe abdominal pain. After an initial examination by Dr. Bloom, she suspected the woman had an ectopic pregnancy. The woman subtly winked at her, seemingly trying to communicate something, but Dr. Bloom didn't understand. When the woman glanced back at the man, Dr. Bloom noticed a strange tattoo. She quickly pulled her assistant aside and said,
"Tattoo behind her ear, I've seen it before. That woman's being sex trafficked."
due to the massive hurricane outside, they planned not to call the police for now. Then Dr. Bloom came up with an idea. They told the patient that the woman needed to do a urine test. The man, visibly nervous, said he didn't want to be separated from his girlfriend. Dr. Bloom reassured him that he could come along and wait right outside the door. Reluctantly, the man agreed. The woman, anxious, went to take the urine test. As she closed the door, she saw a small note on the back of it that read, "April, if you need help, sign in red ink. If not, sign in black." She thought for a moment, then handed her urine sample to Dr. Bloom. The man was still staring intently at her. Dr. Bloom took the small bottle and checked the signature. She knew what to do next. After a while, Dr. Bloom informed the woman that she did, in fact, have an ectopic pregnancy. The man pretended to comfort her. Dr. Bloom then said that the patient needed an emergency abortion. But the man saw through her plan. He claimed that Dr. Bloom was deceiving them, that his girlfriend didn't have an ectopic pregnancy, and that she just needed medication to relieve the pain. Ignoring their protests, the man pushed the wheelchair to leave. Dr. Bloom knew she couldn't stop them anymore, so she let him go. As the man made his way through the dark hallway during the power outage, a nurse caught up with them. She handed the man a bottle of medicine and gave some instructions. The man impatiently took the medication, but when he tried to push the wheelchair, he suddenly realized,
April?
Bo injured his wrist while skateboarding. Dr. Manning recommended an X-ray for the boy. When the results came back, Dr. Manning noticed another healed injury. She asked the mother why this injury wasn't recorded in his medical history. Bo's father said the boy had previously sprained his wrist, and it had healed, so they didn't pay much attention to it.
Remember that?
Poor Bo. Bo's hand is cold.
Griffin, don't touch your brother's hand.
Dr. Manning noted that the boy's hand was indeed cold and recommended immediate surgery. After leaving the room, Dr. Manning expressed her concerns. The boy's wrist injury didn't show bruising but had swelling, which looked more like a recent injury from the past 24 hours and not a fracture. She also recalled that the boy's mother had a bandaged hand but refused to let the doctors examine it. This made Dr. Manning suspect that Bo's father might be abusing his family. So, she sought the help of a psychiatrist. When the psychiatrist suggested treating the mother's hand injury, the father became suspicious and asked them to leave the room. He denied abusing his family and said if they didn't believe him, they could call the police or involve child services. Later, the medical director contacted DCFS. At the same time, a patient injured in a car accident was brought in, and in the rush to save them, blood was left on the floor. Bo's older brother watched the entire rescue operation with great interest. He even picked up a bloodstained button and smelled it. Dr. Charles noticed this and asked if he wasn't afraid of blood. The boy said he wasn't and that he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. Dr. Charles then asked why he wanted to be a doctor.
The knives.
What?
To help people.
This led Dr. Charles to a conclusion. Bo's older brother was the true abuser in the family. He suspected the parents were hiding the truth. Dr. Charles believed he might have antisocial personality disorder. They brought the parents in for a private conversation, but the parents refused to allow a full assessment of Bo's older brother. They feared that if Bo's older brother was diagnosed with a personality disorder, DCFS would take him away. During the discussion, Bo's older brother suddenly disappeared. He had quietly gone to Bo's hospital room, startling everyone. When the doctors and parents arrived, Bo was unharmed, but his blood pressure had spiked, and his heart rate was elevated. The father quickly removed the older brother from the room. As soon as he left, Bo's vitals returned to normal. Dr. Charles explained that Bo's body was reacting to danger with a natural fear response. In the end, the mother refused the recommendation to have Bo's older brother removed from the home. She insisted that everything would get better as he grew older. But when Dr. Manning asked how she would ensure Bo's safety in the future, she couldn't answer. The pregnant woman was brought to the hospital after a fall, but she refused to undergo an X-ray, believing it would harm the baby. She was pregnant for the sake of her daughter with leukemia, and the fetus was a perfect match for her daughter's bone marrow, so she was determined to keep the pregnancy. She explained that her younger son couldn't donate bone marrow to her daughter, and during her last pregnancy, she had already developed cardiomyopathy. This time, the unborn child was the only cure for her daughter, but the doctor said if she doesn't have an abortion and only relies on medication, she might become a vegetable at a later stage. However, just as they were discussing, the woman's condition began to deteriorate. Her daughter fainted because she was worried about her mother. When the girl woke up, Dr. Manning came to speak with her. She asked,
Is she gonna die?
Dr. Manning reassured her that they would do everything they could. The girl began to blame herself, saying that because of her leukemia, the whole family revolved around her, and even her little brother was often neglected. Dr. Manning explained that her parents loved them equally, but the situation was difficult right now. The girl responded by asking,
What about the baby? What's it gonna be like for him?
She expressed that she just wished they could be a normal family. Dr. Manning asked if she had shared these feelings with her mother, and the girl shook her head. Soon after, the mother's condition worsened again, and surgery became unavoidable. Despite this, the mother still wanted to avoid surgery. At this point, her daughter pleaded with her. Dr. Manning mentioned that another option was a coronary bypass, but the success rate for pregnant women was low. If complications arose, the doctors would have to choose to save the mother's life. The daughter begged her mother to go through with the surgery, and in the end, she agreed. After a tense surgery and resuscitation, the doctors were forced to save the mother's life. Sadly, the baby did not survive.
Oh, I'm sorry I failed you.
No, you didn't.
The boy was hospitalized after being beaten by his classmates. After an examination, the doctor discovered that his eye socket and nose were both fractured. When the doctor mentioned hoping that the boy who hurt him would be caught, the boy said he deserved it. He then said something unexpected.
You gotta castrate me.
What?
I want you to castrate me.
Dr. Choi was shocked and confused. The boy said that because all he could think about was sex all the time. Dr. Charles says that's normal for a 17-year-old boy, but the boy said sex should only be about procreation. He was beaten up for peeking at his female classmates in the shower, and he even followed a blonde girl and secretly cut off a lock of her hair. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he couldn't control his urges, which is why he requested chemical castration. Soon after, the boy's parents arrived at the hospital. The doctor explained that chemical castration would require their consent. However, the boy's father said it was ridiculous, and his mother insisted that her son could never do something so extreme. They just wanted him treated and discharged as quickly as possible. When the parents visited the boy in his room, his mother told him, "God wants you to remain pure, free from the pain and immorality of sex." This only made the boy feel even more distressed. The next day, Dr. Choi went to the boy's room and found him missing. At that moment, the boy was in the room of a blonde girl, lifting her blanket. Dr. Choi warned him to stay away from the girl. During the standoff, the boy suddenly ran into the bathroom. Dr. Choi rushed over to open the door but heard a scream. He kicked the door open, but it was too late. The boy had taken a pair of scissors and castrated himself. Dr. Choi couldn't believe the boy had gone through with it so decisively. After the incident, the boy's parents finally came to their senses, but the damage had already caused immense psychological and physical trauma to the boy.